The constabulary arrived within the hour, their presence transforming the Ashford estate from a venue of social gathering into something resembling a stage set for tragedy. Inspector Thornton, a man of 55 with the particular weariness of someone who had seen enough of human failure to regard it as inevitable rather than shocking, stood in the upstairs bedroom with his notebook and his profound skepticism. Eleanor Hartley lay exactly as described, the red roses arranged with such deliberate precision that they seemed almost insulting in their artistry, and the note in her hand bore her signature in handwriting that preliminary examination suggested was indeed her own. The room itself, a guest bedroom with pale green wallpaper and furniture that spoke of comfort rather than luxury, offered little in the way of obvious struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of violence beyond the small bottle of what appeared to be sleeping tablets on the nightstand, empty except for a few remaining pills and the faint chemical smell that suggested cyanide or something equally efficient. Inspector Thornton's working theory, formed with the speed of a man who had learned to recognize patterns in death, was elegantly simple. Eleanor Hartley had come to the estate, possibly at someone's invitation, had taken her own life with premeditation and theatrical flourish, and had arranged the scene to make a final statement that remained, for the moment, incomprehensible. Suicide with roses and apologies seemed to fit the profile of a woman whose life had fractured along the seams of respectability, and the village's recent gossip about Eleanor's increasingly erratic behavior supported this narrative. However, as Inspector Thornton descended the back staircase, carefully stepping over the white flower petals that someone had distributed with such meticulous care, he found himself troubled by details that his experience suggested should not trouble him. The petals, for instance, seemed too fresh, too perfectly placed, too intentional in their arrangement to suggest the despairing gesture of a woman in the grip of suicidal impulse. Suicides, in his observation, were generally messy affairs, both literally and metaphorically, and Eleanor's scene possessed a quality of composition that suggested an external hand in its arrangement. When he reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into the ground-floor corridor, he encountered Miss Marple, who was engaged in what appeared to be a conversation with Mrs. Pemberton, the Ashfords' housekeeper of 30 years, a woman whose face bore the particular expression of someone who had just lost her position, her references, and possibly her understanding of the household she had served with such meticulous attention to routine. Miss Marple, noticing the inspector's approach with the peripheral awareness that had served her so well over decades of observation, excused herself from Mrs. Pemberton with the grace of someone accustomed to gracefully withdrawing from conversations. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness of a woman accustomed to being heard, even when barely raising her voice above a whisper. "I trust you will forgive an old woman's intrusion, but I wondered if you had noticed the curious absence of what should certainly be present in this situation." Inspector Thornton, who had not been expecting to have his investigation complicated by village commentary, regarded Miss Marple with the particular patience reserved for elderly women of obvious refinement. "I should be grateful for any observations, madam," he replied, which was the truth, though not the whole truth. He was already formulating his report, and he preferred observations that supported rather than complicated his preliminary conclusions. Miss Marple gestured with her knitting needle toward the staircase. "The white petals," she said simply. "They are quite fresh, Inspector, and they have been scattered with a precision that suggests not the gesture of a woman in distress, but rather the careful arrangement of someone staging a scene. But what strikes me as more curious is what one does not see. Flowers, particularly white flowers of this variety. They appear to be from the garden, likely stock or perhaps sweet peas, do not scatter themselves with such perfect uniformity. Someone has done this work quite deliberately, and they have done it after Eleanor Hartley's death, not before. The woman would have disturbed them in her final moments, and yet here they lie, arranged like a narrative waiting to be read." Inspector Thornton felt that particular irritation that came when civilians, however well-intentioned, began to complicate straightforward conclusions. And yet, as he looked again at the staircase, he could not entirely dismiss what the old woman had observed. The petals did possess an artificial quality, as though someone had consulted a painter's sketch before executing this particular arrangement. Before the inspector could formulate a response that would politely discourage further interference, a commotion erupted from the direction of the garden. One of the constables came running through the house with the same urgency that the groundskeeper had earlier displayed, and though his news, when it came, was less sensational than Eleanor's death, it possessed a quality of complication that caused Inspector Thornton to close his notebook with a gesture that suggested the case had just become significantly more complex. In the far corner of the Ashford Gardens, near the greenhouse where Marcus Webb kept his more exotic plantings, the constable reported there was evidence that someone had taken a considerable quantity of roses and other flowers within the past several hours. The cutting had been done with deliberation. Entire stems removed, the cuts fresh, the location suggesting that whoever had performed this action possessed knowledge of the garden's layout and the security of its spaces. Marcus Webb, when questioned, confirmed that yes, someone had indeed taken flowers, though he could not determine precisely when or with what intention. Yet as he spoke, Miss Marple noticed that his eyes did not meet those of anyone in authority, and his hands, which had been so assured in their management of the party's refreshments, trembled with something that might have been shock or might, conceivably, have been something rather more self-incriminating. Inspector Thornton stood in the green light of the garden, surrounded by flowers and complications, and wondered if what had appeared to be a straightforward tragedy was instead the beginning of something considerably more intricate, something that would require more than preliminary assumptions and working theories. Something, perhaps, that would require the kind of attention to detail and human nature that only long observation and genuine understanding could provide. The drawing room of the Ashford estate had been transformed into an informal interrogation space, with Inspector Thornton claiming the substantial desk that had belonged to Sir Geoffrey's father, and various members of the household and party guests arranged in a sequence of interviews that would occupy the remainder of the afternoon and well into the evening. Miss Marple had been invited to remain, ostensibly as a witness, but actually, she suspected, because Inspector Thornton had begun to recognize that her observations, however gently offered, possessed a quality of accuracy that his own preliminary assumptions had not. She sat in a corner with her knitting, her needles producing their familiar clicking rhythm, a sound that seemed to calm rather than irritate the various individuals who passed through their own encounters with official scrutiny. The first to be formally questioned was Marcus Webb, the head gardener whose trembling hands and averted eyes had not escaped anyone's notice. He was a man of 38, with the kind of careful appearance that suggested someone acutely aware of how others perceived him, and his initial statement, delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it, was that he had barely known Eleanor Hartley beyond the professional courtesies extended to any village resident. He had seen her occasionally at social functions, had heard the village gossip regarding her separation from James Hartley, but possessed no particular knowledge of her private affairs. When Inspector Thornton pressed him regarding the missing flowers, Marcus's composure showed its first genuine crack. He explained, with increasing agitation, that the cutting had likely occurred sometime between early morning and mid-afternoon, and that he could not possibly know who had taken them because the garden, despite its appearance of careful control, possessed numerous access points that he could not monitor constantly. His defensiveness was notable, and Inspector Thornton's eyes narrowed in that particular way that suggested he had found his working theory confirmed by this very transparency of guilt. Yet Miss Marple, observing the interview from her corner, found herself troubled by something that the inspector seemed to have overlooked. Marcus's anxiety appeared to center not on Eleanor's death, but rather on the missing flowers themselves, on the violation of his carefully maintained garden, and on the implication that someone had moved freely through spaces he considered his domain. When asked directly if he had any relationship with the deceased beyond professional acquaintance, He replied with such vehemence that it seemed almost excessive, speaking of Eleanor as a woman he scarcely knew. A woman of cold temperament and questionable judgment, a woman whose reputation in the village was hardly spotless. The particular intensity of his denial suggested, to Miss Marple's practiced ear, not guilt regarding Eleanor's death, but rather guilt regarding something else entirely, something connected perhaps to the garden or to his position within it. The second interview, conducted while Marcus withdrew to contemplate his situation in increasingly anxious solitude, involved Catherine Ashford, the Ashfords' daughter, who entered the drawing room with the careful composure of someone managing an internal catastrophe beneath the surface of acceptable behavior. She was dressed still in her party clothes, now somewhat disheveled, and her eyes possessed that particular quality of someone who has been crying without quite allowing the tears to fall completely. Inspector Thornton, beginning his questions with the basic facts of timing and location, found Catherine initially forthcoming in the mechanical fashion of someone reciting information rather than communicating genuine recollection. She had seen Eleanor arrive, had watched her mother's response to the guest with that peculiar tension that suggested some historical friction between the two women. She had not, however, been present when Eleanor had apparently excused herself from the party. It was common, Catherine explained, for guests to retire indoors during afternoon gatherings, and no particular notice had been taken of Eleanor's absence until the groundskeeper's horrifying discovery. Yet as Inspector Thornton continued his questioning, probing at the relationships between the various household members, Catherine's responses became increasingly halting, and her hands, which she kept folded tightly in her lap, began to betray a trembling that matched Marcus Webb's earlier agitation. When asked if she had known Eleanor Hartley personally, Catherine hesitated, just barely perceptibly, but perceptibly nonetheless, before confirming that she had met Eleanor at various village functions, that they were acquainted in the manner of all village residents, but that they possessed no particular intimacy. Miss Marple, watching this interview with the particular attention she reserved for moments when human behavior revealed itself as somewhat less than perfectly honest, found herself deeply interested in Catherine's choice of the word intimacy, and in the way the young woman's eyes, when she spoke it, seemed to focus on a point somewhere beyond the room's walls, as though contemplating something the inspector could not see. By the time Catherine was released from her interrogation, Miss Marple had begun to construct a hypothesis, tentative, incomplete, but possessed of a certain logical structure that suggested Eleanor Hartley's death, while certainly a tragedy, might be considerably more complex than either a simple suicide or the obvious crime that Inspector Thornton's preliminary thinking seemed to suggest. As evening descended over the Ashford estate, casting long shadows across the gardens that Eleanor would never walk again, the household settled into that particular state of shock that follows violent disruption of the ordinary world. Sir Geoffrey appeared diminished, as though his wife's authority, which he had always allowed to overshadow his own presence, had been somehow violated by Eleanor's death, leaving him uncertain of his own role in the resulting chaos. Lady Ashford had retreated to her bedroom with what she termed a migraine, but what Mrs. Pemberton, speaking quietly to Miss Marple in the kitchen, seemed to understand as something considerably more substantial. A profound disturbance of the woman's carefully constructed understanding of how her world functioned. The servants moved through the house with that peculiar efficiency of those who respond to crisis through the performance of routine, and James Hartley, Eleanor's estranged husband, had arrived at the estate just as darkness fell, his face bearing an expression that seemed to combine shock, confusion, and something that Miss Marple, in her careful observation of human facial expressions across decades of village life, might have described as relief, though such an emotion would certainly require considerable explanation before anyone could quite believe it. Inspector Thornton, who had been conducting his inquiries with the methodical precision of a man working from a script he had performed countless times before, found himself genuinely disconcerted by James Hartley's arrival. The solicitor was a man of 51, with grey at his temples and the particular bearing of someone accustomed to managing other people's legal complications while maintaining careful distance from his own emotional entanglements. When informed of his estranged wife's death, James had displayed the appropriate shock, the requisite expressions of disbelief and sorrow, and yet beneath these conventional responses, Inspector Thornton detected something that troubled him in ways he could not quite articulate. It was not the relief that Miss Marple had observed, though she, for her part, kept such observations to herself, but rather a quality of performance, as though James Hartley had rehearsed his response to Eleanor's death and was now executing it with professional precision. The inspector's questions regarding James's whereabouts during the afternoon of the party elicited responses that were simultaneously precise and curiously unhelpful. James had been in his law office in the village, reviewing documents for a client's estate settlement, had spoken to no one, had left no witnesses to his location, and could only confirm his presence through the evidence of work completed on his desk and the particular way that his secretary, Miss Charlotte Wells, had left various files arranged for his attention. It was, as Miss Marple reflected while maintaining her steady knitting rhythm, the kind of alibi that was technically unverifiable precisely because it was too carefully constructed, too perfectly logical, too entirely lacking in the messy randomness that characterized genuine human experience. When Inspector Thornton pressed James regarding his relationship with Eleanor, their separation, the circumstances surrounding it, the degree of hostility or amicability that had characterized their recent interactions, James became notably more guarded. He explained with the careful language of a solicitor selecting words as precisely as a jeweler selecting stones, that Eleanor had initiated the separation, that she had found their marriage fundamentally unsatisfying, that they had agreed upon an arrangement that allowed them to maintain cordial, if distant, relations. He acknowledged that there had been complications regarding Eleanor's financial independence, that she had been, in his estimation, somewhat unrealistic about her prospects for self-sufficiency, and that he had harbored concerns regarding certain decisions she had made in the months preceding her death. Yet when asked what such decisions might be, he demurred with the explanation that solicitor-client confidentiality prevented him from elaborating, a response that technically violated no law, but which suggested, to anyone listening carefully, that James Hartley possessed knowledge regarding Eleanor's affairs that he was deliberately withholding. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, just momentarily, when this statement was made, and Inspector Thornton, whose attention had begun to drift in the direction of a conclusion he found increasingly satisfying, failed to notice this small gesture. However, Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained in the room ostensibly to provide refreshment, but actually to observe the proceedings with the particular interest of someone whose entire understanding of household hierarchy depended upon understanding the secrets that moved beneath its surface, certainly noticed. The housekeeper's expression, when she met Miss Marple's eyes across the drawing-room, conveyed a communication that required no words, a suggestion that Eleanor's relationship with James had been considerably more complicated than his, careful language suggested. By the time James Hartley was released from his preliminary interrogation, the evening had deepened into that particular quality of darkness that rural England possessed, a darkness that seemed to contain not merely the absence of light, but rather the presence of something obscuring, something that had settled over the Ashford estate like a physical presence. Inspector Thornton retired to the study, where he began to construct his formal report, and it was clear from his manner and his increasingly satisfied demeanor that he had reached conclusions regarding Eleanor's death that felt sufficiently coherent to present to his superiors. The narrative he was constructing was elegant in its simplicity. Eleanor Hartley, a woman of unstable emotional temperament, separated from her husband, increasingly isolated within the village community, had staged her own death as a final act of theatrical protest against a life she found unendurable. The roses, the petals, the carefully arranged scene, these were the artistic flourishes of a woman making a final statement, and if certain elements of the scenario seemed slightly incongruous with this narrative, Well, suicide itself was often incongruous, and human desperation manifested in forms that logic alone could not fully explain. Yet as the evening progressed and the household began to settle into an uneasy approximation of sleep, Miss Marple found herself conducting her own quiet investigations. She had, through the course of gentle conversations with Mrs. Pemberton and through her careful observation of the various household members' interactions, begun to construct a rather different narrative than the one Inspector Thornton was so eagerly embracing. The flowers, for instance, the white flowers scattered so carefully on the back staircase, were not stock or sweet peas as she had initially observed, but rather stephanotis and white roses, flowers that possessed a particular significance in the language of blossoms that had been so carefully cultivated in the Victorian era. Stephanotis symbolized matrimonial bonds, white roses represented truth and silence, and their combination created a message that seemed far too deliberate, far too carefully constructed, to be the product of Eleanor's own artistic impulses in her final moments. Moreover, when Miss Marple had engaged Mrs. Pemberton in a discussion of household routines and the access various individuals possessed to different rooms, a picture had begun to emerge of the Ashford estate that was considerably more complex than its outward appearance suggested. Eleanor had not arrived at the party entirely by accident. She had been invited specifically, though through channels that remained somewhat obscured. And Catherine Ashford's involvement in this invitation had been, if Mrs. Pemberton's careful hints were to be credited, rather more substantial than Catherine had been willing to admit to Inspector Thornton. As Miss Marple finally retired to the small guest room she had been offered, her needles clicking out their patient rhythm in the darkness, she found herself contemplating not who had killed Eleanor Hartley. That seemed increasingly obvious, but rather why such an elaborate scene had been constructed, and what truth the killer believed such theatrical display was attempting to protect. The morning following Eleanor's death arrived with the kind of bright, unreasonable cheerfulness that autumn mornings sometimes possess, as though nature itself remained indifferent to human tragedy, and determined to proceed with its own seasonal arrangements, regardless of the emotional complications occurring within the village. Inspector Thornton had spent the night at the Ashford estate, occupying the study with his files and his increasingly confident conclusions, and he emerged at breakfast with an air of finality that suggested he believed the substantial work of investigation had been accomplished. Over tea and toast, he explained to Sir Geoffrey and Lady Ashford that preliminary examination of the scene, combined with witness statements and the various physical evidence, all pointed toward a conclusion that, while tragic, was not uncommon in cases involving individuals of Eleanor's particular psychological profile. He would, he assured them, continue with the formal procedures required by law, but he saw little reason to believe that further investigation would yield anything substantially different from his current assessment. Lady Ashford, who had recovered somewhat from her previous distress and had regained enough of her customary composure to make observations about the weather and the regrettable necessity of cancelling the week's social engagements, seemed almost relieved by this pronouncement. The uncertainty, Miss Marple reflected while observing this exchange from her corner with her knitting, was often more disturbing than the conclusion, however unpleasant the conclusion might be. However, as the inspector was preparing to depart the Ashford estate to file his preliminary report, a complication arose that seemed to genuinely surprise him. One of the constables, conducting a final examination of the deceased's personal effects, had discovered something in Eleanor's handbag that appeared to warrant further attention. It was a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery, addressed to Eleanor but not signed, and its contents suggested a relationship considerably more complex than Eleanor's marriage to James, or indeed any relationship that Eleanor was known to have maintained within the village. The letter, which the constable presented to Inspector Thornton with the particular satisfaction of having located something the inspector had apparently missed, was brief but possessed of an emotional intensity that seemed at odds with Eleanor's reputation as a cold and aloof woman. It read simply, "I cannot continue this deception. You must understand that what we have shared is impossible to continue. I have made my decision, and I must ask you to respect it, regardless of the pain it causes us both. Please do not contact me again. It is better this way, for everyone. Forgive me." The handwriting was not Eleanor's, which meant that someone else had written this letter to Eleanor, which meant that Eleanor possessed some relationship involving sufficient emotional complexity to warrant such a communication. Inspector Thornton's previously satisfied demeanor shifted noticeably, and he found himself regarding the Ashford estate with considerably more suspicion than he had displayed moments earlier. When questioned regarding any knowledge of Eleanor's private correspondence or her relationships outside of her marriage, the household members proved remarkably unhelpful. Mrs. Pemberton claimed to have observed no unusual mail, though her hesitation before making this claim suggested she was being technically truthful, while considerably less than forthcoming regarding what she might actually know. James Hartley, when informed of the letter's existence, displayed genuine shock that seemed less performative than his earlier responses, and he insisted with what appeared to be genuine conviction that he possessed no knowledge of any relationship that Eleanor might have maintained outside of their marriage. Sir Geoffrey and Lady Ashford both professed complete ignorance, though Lady Ashford's particular intensity in this claim suggested that ignorance might be a more actively maintained state than a natural condition. It was Miss Marple, however, who noted the significance of Catherine Ashford's response to the letter's discovery. When the inspector, having obtained permission to question the household members again in light of this new development, presented the letter to Catherine and asked if she possessed any knowledge of Eleanor's private affairs, the young woman's face underwent a transformation that lasted only a fraction of a second, but which conveyed volumes of information to anyone observing her carefully. It was not shock that registered on Catherine's features, but rather something closer to confirmation, as though she had suspected, or perhaps known all along, that Eleanor possessed such correspondence, and the letter's discovery simply confirmed what Catherine had been internally struggling to conceal. When pressed, Catherine initially maintained that she knew nothing of Eleanor's private relationships, but Inspector Thornton, his investigative instincts finally awakened by this series of complications, pressed further. He noted the particular intensity of Catherine's reaction, the way her hands trembled as she held the letter, the manner in which her eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the room's walls, precisely the same behavioral pattern that had characterized her responses during the previous evening's interview. Under this sustained pressure, Catherine began to crack, and what emerged was a narrative considerably more complex than Eleanor's apparent suicide. Catherine acknowledged that she had known Eleanor possessed a relationship with someone in the village, though she claimed ignorance regarding the specific identity of this person. She had discovered this knowledge by accident, through overhearing a telephone conversation between Eleanor and this unnamed individual, and she had been uncertain what to do with this information, particularly given her family's social standing and the potential complications that such a revelation might create. She had been disturbed by Eleanor's obvious emotional distress, by the way Eleanor had seemed torn between loyalty to this person and her own need for independence, and Catherine suspected, though she possessed no concrete evidence, that Eleanor's recent behavior, her increasing isolation, and her apparent depression had all been connected to this unresolved relationship. Most significantly, Catherine revealed that Eleanor had visited the Ashford estate on the morning of the party, apparently to meet with someone, though Catherine could not determine with whom or for what purpose. She had observed Eleanor speaking with Marcus Webb near the greenhouse, had noticed their interaction possessed a particular quality of intimacy that went beyond the professional courtesies between gardener and guest, and had been troubled by the implications of what she had witnessed. By the time Catherine finished her confession, Inspector Thornton's preliminary conclusions had become considerably less preliminary, and his satisfied demeanor had transformed into something far more troubled, as though he had begun to recognize that Eleanor's death, rather than being a straightforward tragedy, might actually represent something considerably more sinister. A crime, perhaps, rather than a suicide, and one that required rather more careful investigation than his initial assumptions had suggested. With Catherine's revelation regarding Marcus Webb and Eleanor's morning visit to the estate, Inspector Thornton's investigation took on a considerably sharper focus, though not entirely in the direction that the newly aroused suspicion might have suggested. He summoned Marcus to the study with the particular gravity of someone who has moved from preliminary questioning to something rather more confrontational, and when the head gardener entered, his previous nervousness had crystallized into something approaching panic. Inspector Thornton, presenting the facts with methodical precision, asked Marcus to explain the nature of his relationship with Eleanor Hartley, and specifically to account for his movements during the morning of the party, a period that had previously seemed irrelevant, but which now possessed considerable significance. Marcus's initial denials proved remarkably short-lived. Under the weight of Catherine's testimony and the inspector's increasingly pointed questions, he collapsed into admission with the characteristic weakness of someone who had been maintaining a pretense that required constant effort and who found relief in its dissolution. Yes, he acknowledged, he had known Eleanor Hartley. Yes, they had maintained a relationship that went considerably beyond professional acquaintance. And yes, Eleanor had visited the estate that morning, though he insisted that the purpose of her visit had been entirely innocent, or as innocent as such meetings could be when conducted in secret. The relationship had begun 6 months ago, coinciding precisely with Eleanor's separation from James and with Marcus's arrival at the Ashford estate. Eleanor had visited the gardens on the pretext of consulting regarding plantings for her cottage, and they had discovered in each other a connection that seemed to both of them to transcend the ordinary social restrictions that governed village life. They had been cautious, discreet, meeting only occasionally and always in circumstances that would not raise suspicion, but Eleanor had become increasingly distressed by the deception, increasingly convinced that their relationship, however genuine, could not continue without causing considerable harm to both of them. The morning of the party, Eleanor had come to tell Marcus that they must end their association, that she could not bear the constant concealment, and that she had decided to leave the village entirely, to relocate to London, where she might begin again without the weight of village judgment and family complications. Miss Marple, observing this confession from her corner, found herself troubled by several aspects of Marcuse's narrative. He spoke of Eleanor's decision with genuine sorrow, and his account of their relationship possessed a quality of emotional authenticity that seemed difficult to fabricate. Yet something in his story did not align with the physical evidence of Eleanor's death, and more particularly, it did not explain the elaborate scene with the flowers, the carefully arranged petals, or the theatrical quality that had characterized the staging of Eleanor's suicide or murder, as the case increasingly appeared to be. When Inspector Thornton pressed Marcus regarding Eleanor's state of mind during their morning conversation, and specifically whether she had exhibited any suicidal ideation or expressed despair sufficient to suggest self-harm, Marcus responded with evident confusion. Eleanor had been sad, certainly, and resigned to the necessity of separation. But she had not been despairing in any sense that Marcus would characterize as dangerous. If anything, she had seemed almost relieved by her decision, as though she had resolved a conflict that had been tormenting her, and she had spoken of the future in terms that suggested she possessed plans and intentions. She had mentioned, in fact, that she intended to speak with her solicitor, presumably meaning James, though that detail seemed oddly incongruent with Eleanor's apparent desire for independence, and that she was considering pursuing a career in music education outside of the village, perhaps in a larger city where her talents might be better appreciated, and where she might escape the particular social judgment that village life imposed upon unmarried women of uncertain standing. When Marcus was finally released from the interrogation, visibly exhausted and emotionally depleted, Inspector Thornton found himself in the unusual position of possessing considerably more information but arriving at conclusions considerably less certain than he had entertained the previous day. The letter discovered in Eleanor's handbag, which he had assumed might be in Marcus's handwriting, proved upon careful examination to be written in a script that bore no resemblance to the head gardener's hand. The flowers that Marcus admitted to providing to Eleanor, a small bouquet of garden roses that Eleanor had taken with her when she left the estate that morning, bore no resemblance to the stephanotis and white roses that had been arranged so carefully on the back staircase. And most significantly, Marcus's emotional response to Eleanor's death seemed entirely genuine, the response of a man who had lost someone he cared for, not the calculated performance of a murderer. As the afternoon progressed and Inspector Thornton continued his investigations with noticeably less certainty than he had previously displayed, Miss Marple requested a private interview with the inspector. She was granted this courtesy with a particular indulgence extended to elderly women of obvious respectability, and when they were alone in the study, she presented her observations with the characteristic gentleness that masked her fundamental certainty regarding what she had observed. She began by discussing the flowers in what seemed like a casual manner, mentioning their particular significance in Victorian language, noting the precision with which they had been arranged, and observing that such knowledge seemed inconsistent with what one knew of Marcus Webb's educational background. She then proceeded to discuss the letter, noting that while it suggested an intimate relationship, its author possessed a particular quality of conflict between personal desire and social obligation that seemed characteristic of someone facing circumstances quite different from those that would concern Marcus. She mentioned, almost incidentally, the curious timing of Eleanor's planned departure from the village, and she observed that such a departure would have significant implications for various individuals whose lives Eleanor's presence had affected. Finally, and most significantly, she directed Inspector Thornton's attention to a detail that he had apparently overlooked entirely: the handwriting in Eleanor's apparent suicide note. The message reading "Forgive me," that Eleanor was believed to have written before taking her own life, bore remarkable similarity to the handwriting found in the letter discovered in Eleanor's handbag, despite being written by two ostensibly different individuals. If one examined the letters carefully, Miss Marple suggested, one might discover that the suicide note had not been written by Eleanor at all, but rather by whoever had written the letter expressing the determination to end their relationship. And if that were the case, then Eleanor Hartley had not committed suicide, but had instead been murdered by someone with considerable knowledge of the village, considerable access to the Ashford estate, and considerable motivation to stage Eleanor's death in a manner that would suggest her own desperation rather than external villainy. The trial of Sir Geoffrey Ashford proceeded with the formality and gravity that British jurisprudence reserved for cases involving persons of considerable social standing and crimes of such manifest deliberation. The proceedings were conducted in the assize court in the nearest substantial city, drawing considerable attention from the London newspapers, which had seized upon the narrative of respectability, concealing murderous impulse with the enthusiasm that the press typically reserved for such stories. Miss Marple attended the trial on two separate occasions, sitting quietly in the gallery with her knitting, observing not merely the legal proceedings, but the reactions of the various individuals whose lives had intersected with Eleanor's death and whose futures had been irrevocably altered by Sir Geoffrey's act of violence. The prosecution's case was constructed with methodical precision, presenting the evidence in logical sequence. The forged handwriting, the toxicological findings, the testimony of Lady Ashford regarding her discovery of Eleanor's body, Jennifer Marsh's account of observing Sir Geoffrey in the upper corridor, and the various circumstantial details that, when accumulated, created an overwhelming narrative of guilt. Sir Geoffrey's defence counsel, a formidable woman from London who had built a reputation on defending the indefensible through meticulous attention to procedural detail and aggressive cross-examination, attempted to construct a narrative of reasonable doubt by emphasizing the possibility that Eleanor had indeed committed suicide as she had been staged to appear, and that Sir Geoffrey's presence in the corridor and his knowledge regarding the poison could be explained through innocent circumstances. However, the accumulated weight of evidence, combined with Sir Geoffrey's own eventual confession, rendered such defences largely theoretical rather than genuinely persuasive. What emerged during the trial proceedings, and what Inspector Thornton had not fully uncovered during his investigation, was the particular manner in which Sir Geoffrey's financial interests had been threatened by Eleanor's knowledge of Lady Ashford's historical activities. Through testimony from various financial experts and from James Hartley himself, acting as a reluctant witness to circumstances he had endeavored to conceal, the court learned that Lady Ashford's support for progressive causes regarding women's health and independence had been financed substantially through Sir Geoffrey's family resources, and that certain of these financial transactions had been conducted in ways that skirted the legal boundaries of propriety without quite crossing them. The revelation of these arrangements would have created complications regarding Sir Geoffrey's social standing and possibly his legal standing as well, though perhaps not the catastrophic consequences that Sir Geoffrey had convinced himself would ensue from exposure. The trial thus became not merely the prosecution of Eleanor's murder, but also the exposure of a network of historical secrets and moral compromises that the Ashford family had maintained with considerable care and considerable cost. By the time the jury delivered its verdict of guilty on the charge of murder, the accumulated revelations had transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into something closer to a comprehensive examination of the manner in which respectability, maintained through decades of careful management and selective silence, could ultimately collapse into violence when confronted with the possibility of public exposure. Sir Geoffrey's sentencing to life imprisonment proceeded without apparent emotion from the defendant himself, who seemed by that point to have retreated into an internal state of resignation that suggested he had reconciled himself to the consequences of his actions. Lady Ashford, observing the proceedings from the gallery, maintained her composure with the same discipline that had characterized her social management throughout her life, though observers noted that she appeared to have aged substantially during the course of the trial, as though the public exposure of her historical activities and her husband's violence had stripped away the protective mechanisms through which she had maintained her carefully constructed persona. The village of St. Mary Mead, following the conclusion of the trial, underwent a peculiar transformation in the weeks and months that followed. The narrative of Eleanor's murder gradually faded from the collective consciousness, replaced by new scandals and new complications, as villages perpetually do. However, the knowledge that violence and murder could occur within the most respectable households, and that the surfaces of propriety could conceal depths of deception and desperation, lingered in the community's awareness, like a permanent stain that no amount of ordinary social interaction could entirely remove. Miss Marple's final reflections on the case came several months after Sir Geoffrey's sentencing, during a conversation with her friend Dr. Haydock, the village's physician, who visited her cottage for tea, and found her in her customary chair with her knitting proceeding with meticulous precision. She observed to Dr. Haydock that Eleanor's death had been ultimately tragic, not because Eleanor possessed knowledge that should have been concealed, but because she had possessed that knowledge without fully understanding its implications or its potential consequences for various individuals, whose social and financial circumstances depended upon its remaining hidden. Eleanor had been, in essence, murdered not for what she had done, but for what she might do with information that had come to her through innocent channels and which she had discussed without malicious intent. The tragedy of human society, Miss Marple suggested, lay in the particular manner in which dangerous knowledge and vulnerable circumstances combine to produce violence, not through the inevitable operation of natural law, but through the choices that individuals made regarding how to respond to perceived threats, to their established positions and carefully maintained appearances. Sir Geoffrey had chosen violence as his response to the possibility of exposure, and in choosing violence, he had transformed a manageable situation into a catastrophe that had destroyed not merely Eleanor's life, but also the social position and personal integrity of every individual connected to the Ashford household. The murder, viewed from this perspective, was less a triumph of criminal cunning than a spectacular demonstration of human error, a revelation of the manner in which intelligent people, possessed of considerable resources and social advantages, could nevertheless make choices so fundamentally destructive that they destroyed themselves as thoroughly as they destroyed their victims. The passage of the seasons brought a gradual restoration of ordinary rhythms to St. Mary Mead, though the village retained a curious quality of heightened awareness regarding the fragility of the social order and the potential for violence lurking beneath surfaces of apparent respectability. Winter arrived with its customary severity, and Miss Marple found herself engaged in the familiar patterns of village life that had occupied her for so many decades. Attending church services, maintaining her correspondence with distant relations, conducting her careful observations of the individuals whose lives intersected with her own, and pursuing her knitting with a dedication that had become as much a part of her identity as her remarkable capacity for recognizing the patterns of human motivation. It was during one of these ordinary afternoons, as snow fell softly outside her cottage windows and she sat with her needles clicking their familiar rhythm, that a letter arrived from Inspector Thornton, containing information that seemed to demand a revision of certain conclusions that the investigation had previously reached. The graphological analysis of the forged suicide note, conducted by the London expert who had initially confirmed Sir Geoffrey's authorship, had been subjected to further scrutiny by an independent examiner appointed by Sir Geoffrey's defense counsel. This second examination had raised certain questions regarding the authenticity of the conclusions that had been drawn from the initial analysis, questions that suggested the forged note might not have been composed by Sir Geoffrey at all, but rather by someone else entirely, someone whose handwriting possessed certain characteristics that could have been misinterpreted during the initial examination. Inspector Thornton's letter conveyed his growing concern that the case, while concluded in terms of Sir Geoffrey's conviction and imprisonment, might not have reached its genuine resolution. The evidence regarding Sir Geoffrey's presence in the upper corridor and his acquisition of cyanide remained substantial and damning. Yet the possibility that the suicide note had been forged by a different hand than that which had administered the poison created a complication that suggested the crime might have been orchestrated by more than one person, or that certain aspects of the crime scene staging had been conducted by someone other than Eleanor's actual murderer. Inspector Thornton requested Miss Marple's opinion regarding this development, seeking her particular insight into the patterns of human motivation and cooperation that might explain how such a crime could have been perpetrated through a conspiracy rather than through the actions of a single individual. Miss Marple's response to this communication came not through letters, but through the vehicle of a personal visit to Inspector Thornton's office, undertaken with the particular determination that characterized her when she possessed observations she believed to be of genuine significance. She arrived on a gray January afternoon, her small frame wrapped in dark wool, her eyes carrying that particular quality of certainty that suggested she had recognized something in the investigative record that had previously escaped notice. Miss Marple's analysis of the forged suicide note began with observations regarding the handwriting itself and the particular manner in which certain letters had been formed with characteristics that suggested deliberate alteration rather than natural variation. She noted that while Sir Geoffrey's hand might have produced something resembling Eleanor's writing, the suicide note possessed qualities that suggested a different author attempting to mimic Eleanor's characteristic formations while simultaneously executing the work with a precision that implied considerable care and planning. The note, in short, had the qualities of a calculated forgery executed by someone with substantial familiarity with Eleanor's handwriting and with the forger's own hand, sufficiently controlled to execute the deception without introducing obvious inconsistencies. This suggested, Miss Marple explained, that the suicide note had been forged not by Sir Geoffrey in the panic following his administration of poison, but rather by someone who had planned Eleanor's death with considerable deliberation and who had arranged the staging of the crime scene as part of a predetermined design. No, When Inspector Thornton pressed Miss Marple regarding the identity of this alternative forger, she posed a gentle question regarding James Hartley's relationship to Eleanor, and regarding the particular nature of his knowledge regarding Eleanor's financial circumstances and her plans for independence. James, as Eleanor's estranged husband and as a solicitor, would have possessed both intimate familiarity with Eleanor's handwriting and the professional skill to forge her signature with considerable precision. Moreover, James possessed financial motivation arising from Eleanor's potential claim to alimony and from the complications that her independence represented for his own legal standing and professional reputation. Inspector Thornton's subsequent investigation of James Hartley proceeded with considerably more intensity than the preliminary questioning had involved, and under sustained pressure regarding the specifics of his interactions with Sir Geoffrey and Lady Ashford, James eventually acknowledged a conspiracy that had been constructed with remarkable deliberation. He had known, through his role as the Ashford solicitor, of the potential consequences that Eleanor's knowledge of Lady Ashford's historical activities represented for the family's interests. He had been aware, through his marriage to Eleanor and his understanding of her character, that Eleanor possessed a moral sensibility that would likely compel her to utilize this knowledge in ways that would be professionally destructive to James himself, whose reputation depended upon discretion and whose client relationships would be threatened by association with Eleanor's potential disclosures. James had therefore approached Sir Geoffrey with a proposal that they combine their interests and their efforts to eliminate Eleanor as a threat, with James providing the forged suicide note that would be integrated into the crime scene staging, and Sir Geoffrey providing the physical mechanism of Eleanor's death through administration of poison. The conspiracy had been executed with remarkable coordination, and James had believed that the forged note, combined with Sir Geoffrey's staging of the scene, would create sufficient confusion regarding Eleanor's death to allow both conspirators to escape suspicion. However, the graphological analysis, intended to confirm Sir Geoffrey's authorship of the note, had inadvertently revealed the existence of the conspiracy by suggesting that the note had been forged by a different hand than Sir Geoffrey's, thereby introducing the possibility of a second perpetrator. The revelation of this conspiracy necessitated the reopening of the investigation and the reconsideration of charges against James Hartley, who was ultimately convicted as a co-conspirator in Eleanor's murder and sentenced to imprisonment equivalent to Sir Geoffrey's own sentence. The conclusion of the case, this time genuinely final, seemed to vindicate Miss Marple's observation regarding the complexity of human motivation and the manner in which seemingly simple crimes often concealed networks of conspiracy and cooperation that suggested the involvement of multiple individuals acting in concert toward a common objective. The village of St. Mary Mead, upon learning of James Hartley's involvement and of the conspiracy between the solicitor and the baronet, underwent a final transformation in its collective understanding of Eleanor's death, recognizing that what had appeared to be a crime of passion or desperation had actually been a carefully orchestrated act of premeditated murder, executed by two men whose professional interests and social standing had depended upon Eleanor's removal from existence. The third day following Eleanor's death brought a development that seemed, on its surface, entirely disconnected from the murder itself, yet which Miss Marple recognized immediately as possessing considerable significance for the ultimate resolution of the case. Jennifer Marsh, the Ashfords' young lady's maid, had attempted to leave the village without informing anyone of her departure, a departure that was discovered only because Mrs. Pemberton had noticed her absence during the morning's household routines and had alerted Inspector Thornton to this potentially suspicious circumstance. Jennifer was located at the railway station in the nearby market town, her small suitcase packed with the essentials of her life, her ticket purchased for London with funds that seemed inconsistent with a servant's typical wages. When brought back to the Ashford estate and questioned regarding her precipitous departure, Jennifer initially maintained that she had merely decided to seek better employment opportunities in London and saw no reason to provide advance notice to the household. However, Inspector Thornton's discovery that Jennifer had withdrawn a considerable sum of money from the village bank the morning following Eleanor's death suggested that her motivations might be considerably more complicated than simple career advancement. Under sustained questioning, Jennifer finally revealed that she had been present in the Ashford estate on the afternoon of the party at a time when she should have been occupied with household duties, and that she possessed knowledge regarding Eleanor's movements that she had previously failed to communicate to the investigating authorities. More significantly, Jennifer admitted that she had observed Lady Ashford in circumstances that seemed to require explanation. Circumstances that suggested the lady of the house had been engaged in activities considerably more suspicious than her usual afternoon pursuits. What Jennifer had witnessed, delivered with obvious reluctance and with the particular fear of someone who understood that her employment and perhaps her reputation depended upon the discretion with which she handled this revelation, was Lady Ashford's presence in the upper corridor near the guest bedroom where Eleanor's body had subsequently been discovered. Jennifer had been carrying fresh linens to various rooms when she had encountered Lady Ashford emerging from that very bedroom at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a time that corresponded precisely with the period during which Eleanor must have died. Lady Ashford had appeared flustered, her usual composure noticeably disrupted, and she had instructed Jennifer with unusual firmness to forget that she had witnessed this encounter, offering financial inducement to ensure the servant's silence. Jennifer, frightened and confused by this interaction, had initially complied with Lady Ashford's instructions, but the discovery of Eleanor's body and the subsequent investigation had generated such anxiety that Jennifer had decided her safest course of action was to remove herself from the village entirely, hence her attempted departure. This revelation seemed to point with considerable directness toward Lady Ashford as Eleanor's killer, and Inspector Thornton wasted little time in summoning the lady of the house to the study for what was now clearly an interrogation rather than a casual interview. Lady Ashford, upon being confronted with Jennifer's testimony, underwent a transformation that seemed to divide her into 2 entirely distinct individuals. The composed, authoritative woman who had greeted guests at the garden party and who had maintained her social position through decades of careful management of village perception seemed to collapse beneath the weight of this accusation, revealing a woman considerably more vulnerable, considerably more emotionally disrupted than anyone would have suspected. She admitted, with visible reluctance and with expressions of profound distress, that she had indeed been in the upstairs corridor during the afternoon of the party, and that she had indeed encountered Eleanor in circumstances that required explanation. Eleanor had been in the house, she explained, not as a guest at the party, but because Catherine had arranged a private meeting between Eleanor and Lady Ashford herself, a meeting that had been designed to address the complications created by Eleanor's presence in the village and her relationships with various members of the Ashford household. Lady Ashford had gone to the guest bedroom expecting to find Eleanor waiting for her, and had instead discovered Eleanor already dead, the roses arranged on her chest, the suicide note already composed and held in Eleanor's rigid hand. Shocked and terrified by this discovery, Lady Ashford had panicked, had fled the room without investigating further or alerting anyone to what she had found, and had spent the subsequent hours attempting to determine what had occurred and how to manage the situation without involving herself in whatever tragic circumstances had led to Eleanor's death. Miss Marple's response to this explanation, offered with characteristic gentleness yet possessed of fundamental skepticism, was to observe that Lady Ashford's account failed to adequately explain several critical details. If Eleanor had already been dead when Lady Ashford entered the room, as the lady claimed, then Lady Ashford had witnessed the staging of the crime scene and could potentially provide substantial information regarding the identity of Eleanor's killer. Furthermore, if Lady Ashford had not engaged in the murder itself, her decision to remain silent and to attempt to conceal what she had witnessed constituted a form of obstruction of justice that was itself a serious crime. Most significantly, Miss Marple noted, Lady Ashford's account did not explain why Catherine would have arranged a meeting between her mother and Eleanor without informing Eleanor that such a meeting was to occur. nor did it explain the specific nature of the complications that Lady Ashford had intended to address through this encounter. Under this gentle but relentless questioning, Lady Ashford's carefully constructed account began to unravel, and what emerged was a considerably more complex narrative involving not merely Eleanor's murder, but also the network of secrets that had rendered Eleanor's presence in the village fundamentally threatening to multiple individuals whose social positions and personal circumstances depended upon the maintenance of appearances that Eleanor's very existence seemed to challenge. Lady Ashford's confession, delivered with a particular quality of relief that often accompanies the dissolution of carefully maintained pretense, revealed that the complications surrounding Eleanor's presence in the village extended considerably beyond the romantic entanglements and social improprieties that had previously been acknowledged. Eleanor Hartley, it emerged, had possessed knowledge of circumstances involving Lady Ashford's past that threatened not merely the lady's social standing, but potentially her freedom and her family's honor. Specifically, Eleanor had discovered through her relationship with Catherine that Lady Ashford had, decades prior, engaged in activities that, while technically legal, would have been considered profoundly scandalous by the standards of respectable society. Lady Ashford, in her youth, had been involved in certain progressive movements regarding women's independence and bodily autonomy, activities that had included providing discreet assistance to women seeking solutions to unwanted pregnancies during an era when such assistance was both illegal and morally condemned by conventional society. Eleanor had learned of these historical circumstances and had, perhaps without fully understanding the implications of her knowledge, mentioned them to Catherine during their intimate conversations. Catherine, frightened by the potential consequences of this revelation and by the realization that Eleanor possessed information that could destroy her mother's reputation, had confided this anxiety to Lady Ashford, thereby setting in motion the events that would culminate in Eleanor's death. Lady Ashford's initial response to learning that Eleanor possessed this knowledge had been one of panic and desperation. She had arranged, through Catherine, for Eleanor to visit the estate under the pretext of a private conversation that might allow Lady Ashford to persuade Eleanor to maintain her silence. However, when Lady Ashford had entered the guest bedroom to find Eleanor already dead, she had experienced a moment of genuine confusion regarding the implications of this discovery. Eleanor's death, staged as a suicide with the elaborate arrangement of flowers and the carefully composed note, had seemed to Lady Ashford initially like a solution to her difficulties, though a solution that had arrived through means she could not comprehend. Her instinct had been to protect her family by remaining silent regarding what she had witnessed, and this silence had seemed, at the moment, like the most prudent course of action available to her. However, as Inspector Thornton continued his questioning, he pressed Lady Ashford on the critical point that Miss Marple had raised. Who had actually committed Eleanor's murder, and why had that person staged the scene in precisely the manner that they had? Lady Ashford's response to this question was delivered with visible reluctance and with expressions of profound distress, for it required her to acknowledge circumstances regarding her own family that she had been unwilling to confront. Eleanor had not been murdered by Lady Ashford, nor had she been murdered by any external party seeking revenge or justice for wrongs committed in the past. Rather, Eleanor had been murdered by someone who had been present at the garden party, someone with access to the estate, someone with knowledge of Eleanor's movements and intentions, and someone whose own circumstances had been sufficiently threatened by Eleanor's presence and knowledge to justify the considerable risk of murder. That someone was Sir Geoffrey Ashford, Lady Ashford's husband, who had possessed knowledge of his wife's historical activities, and who had learned through Catherine's inadvertent revelation that Eleanor possessed this same knowledge. Sir Geoffrey's concern, however, had not been primarily motivated by anxiety regarding his wife's reputation, though that concern was certainly present. Rather, Sir Geoffrey had discovered, through means that he was initially reluctant to disclose, that Eleanor's knowledge of Lady Ashford's historical activities extended to certain financial arrangements that Sir Geoffrey himself had facilitated. arrangements that had involved his own family's considerable wealth and that constituted, in effect, a conspiracy to conceal illegal activities. The discovery that Eleanor possessed this knowledge had convinced Sir Geoffrey that Eleanor represented a threat not merely to his wife's standing but to his own freedom and to the preservation of his family's financial interests. What had transpired on the afternoon of Eleanor's death was, according to Lady Ashford's eventual acknowledgment, as follows. Sir Geoffrey had positioned himself near the back staircase of the house, a location that provided access to the guest bedroom and which allowed him to intercept Eleanor as she moved through the house following her conversation with Catherine. He had persuaded her to enter the bedroom under the pretext of discussing a matter of private importance, and once inside, he had administered a substance, the same substance that appeared in the toxicological examination to be cyanide, through a prepared cup of tea that he had claimed was offered as a courtesy. Eleanor's death had been relatively swift, and Sir Geoffrey had then engaged in the elaborate staging of the scene, arranging the roses with care, composing the suicide note in an approximation of Eleanor's handwriting that he believed would withstand cursory examination, and creating the path of white flower petals that seemed designed both as artistic flourish and as deliberate communication to anyone who might understand the language of flowers. The theatrical quality of this staging had not been motivated by any desire to create confusion regarding Eleanor's death, but rather by Sir Geoffrey's conviction that a suicide, properly arranged and properly communicated through the symbolic language of flowers, would be accepted by both the village and the authorities without substantial investigation. Miss Marple's observation that this strategy had depended entirely upon investigators failing to notice the forged handwriting and the symbolic meaning of the carefully selected flowers suggested that Sir Geoffrey had perhaps underestimated the capacity of law enforcement to recognize deliberate deception when presented with sufficient motivation to do so. The revelation of Sir Geoffrey's culpability created a cascade of additional complications, for it required Inspector Thornton to confront not merely the murder itself, but the network of conspiracy and silence that had allowed such a crime to be contemplated and executed by a man of apparently respectable standing. Sir Geoffrey's arrest proceeded with a quiet efficiency that seemed oddly anticlimactic given the elaborate nature of the crime, and as he was led away from the Ashford estate, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the particular way that human nature so often arranged itself beneath surfaces of respectability and composure, waiting only for the right moment to fracture and reveal the darkness that lay beneath. The formal conclusion of the investigation proceeded with the methodical precision that Inspector Thornton had learned to apply to matters of such considerable legal and social significance. Sir Geoffrey Ashford, confronted with the accumulating evidence, the forged handwriting confirmed by the London graphologist, the toxicological examination revealing cyanide in Eleanor's system, the testimony of both Lady Ashford and Jennifer Marsh regarding his presence in the upper corridor at the critical time, had initially maintained his protestations of innocence with the conviction of a man accustomed to having his assertions accepted without substantial challenge. However, as the evidence mounted and as Inspector Thornton presented each detail with relentless precision, Sir Geoffrey's resistance had gradually eroded into a state of resigned acknowledgement. He had confessed finally to Eleanor's murder, though he had maintained with considerable insistence that the murder had not been premeditated in any conventional sense, but rather had been an act of desperate impulse born from circumstances that had spiraled entirely beyond his capacity to manage through more conventional means. Sir Geoffrey's account of the murder itself differed in certain respects from Lady Ashford's second-hand testimony, though the fundamental facts remained consistent. He had encountered Eleanor in the guest bedroom, had persuaded her to accept a cup of tea that he had prepared with cyanide obtained from the estate's greenhouse supplies, and had then engaged in the elaborate staging of her death as a suicide. His motivations, he insisted, had been animated not by malice toward Eleanor personally, but by the existential necessity of protecting his family's reputation and financial interests from the catastrophic consequences of Eleanor's knowledge and her apparent willingness to utilize that knowledge as leverage within the village. Miss Marple's final observation regarding Sir Geoffrey's case came not during the formal investigation, but rather during a private conversation with Inspector Thornton conducted in the drawing-room of the Ashford estate on the morning of Sir Geoffrey's formal remand to custody. She noted, with the characteristic gentleness that masked her fundamental understanding of human motivation, that Sir Geoffrey had been the architect not merely of Eleanor's death, but of the entire network of circumstances that had rendered Eleanor's death seem, in his own calculations, to be necessary. He had failed to recognize that Eleanor possessed no inherent desire to cause harm to Lady Ashford or to exploit the historical circumstances that she had learned of through her relationship with Catherine. Eleanor had been motivated by curiosity and by the desire to understand the woman who had given birth to Catherine, not by any intention to utilize this knowledge as a weapon. Sir Geoffrey's belief that Eleanor represented an existential threat had been, in essence, a projection of his own anxieties regarding the potential fragility of the social structures and financial arrangements upon which his comfortable existence depended. In attempting to eliminate the perceived threat, he had merely confirmed the very anxiety that had motivated him, transforming Eleanor's possession of dangerous knowledge into an actual danger through the mechanism of his own violent response. The murder, Miss Marple observed, was in many respects a tragedy not of Eleanor's making but of Sir Geoffrey's own creation, born from his inability to distinguish between actual threat and imagined catastrophe. The aftermath of the investigation proceeded with the gradual restoration of routine that characterizes the responses of villages to disruptions of their social order, though the restoration was necessarily incomplete and forever marked by the knowledge of what had occurred within the respected confines of the Ashford estate. Lady Ashford, stripped of the husband whose authority had paralleled her own, aged noticeably in the weeks following Sir Geoffrey's arrest, and she gradually withdrew from the social activities that had previously occupied so much of her time and attention. Catherine, traumatized by her role in precipitating the events that had culminated in Eleanor's death, made arrangements to relocate to London, where she accepted a position as a music instructor and seemed, by all accounts, to construct a life substantially removed from the village that had witnessed her emotional complications and their tragic consequences. Marcus Webb, released from suspicion and restored to his position as head gardener, remained at the Ashford estate for several months before accepting a position at a larger estate in the Cotswolds, his brief connection to Eleanor Hartley having left him with a melancholy that seemed to deepen rather than diminish with the passage of time. James Hartley, Eleanor's estranged husband, proved surprisingly generous in the administration of Eleanor's estate, contributing substantially to a memorial fund established in her name to support music education in the village school, an act of belated generosity that seemed to suggest a capacity for remorse regarding his own role in Eleanor's isolation and vulnerability. Jennifer Marsh, her attempted departure having been thwarted by the investigation's demands, remained in her position as lady's maid for a time before eventually securing better employment in the market town, where she established herself as a woman of discretion and reliability, qualities that the investigation had demonstrated she genuinely possessed. Miss Marple's departure from the Ashford estate occurred without fanfare or ceremony, her small bag packed with the efficient precision that characterized all her movements, her knitting needles safely secured in their case, her observations and conclusions communicated to Inspector Thornton with the clarity and certainty that had guided his investigation toward its inevitable conclusion. Inspector Thornton, standing at the door of the estate as her taxi arrived to convey her back to St. Mary Mead, expressed his gratitude with genuine warmth, acknowledging that without her particular gift for observing the patterns of human behavior, the mind's eye case would likely have concluded with an incorrect assumption regarding Eleanor's death and a murderer allowed to retreat into the comfortable obscurity of apparent respectability. Miss Marple's response was characteristically modest, suggesting that she had merely applied the principle that human nature, in villages and in the wider world alike, operated according to patterns established by centuries of social conditioning and personal motivation, and that those patterns, once recognized, revealed their meanings with an almost mathematical precision. The village of St. Mary Mead, when Miss Marple returned to her cottage and resumed her life of quiet observation and careful knitting, seemed to her somewhat diminished by her absence from the investigation, as though the violent disruption of Eleanor's death had left a permanent mark upon the community's understanding of itself. Yet life proceeded as life invariably proceeds, with new scandals and new complications gradually replacing the memory of Eleanor's tragic end, and with the village's collective consciousness gradually restoring the comfortable illusion of safety and stability that had previously characterized its existence. Miss Marple, settling into her familiar chair with her knitting needles clicking their patient rhythm, reflected that this process of forgetting and restoration was, perhaps, both the greatest tragedy and the greatest mercy that human communities possessed. The capacity to acknowledge horror and then systematically to erase it from collective memory, allowing ordinary life to resume its ordinary patterns as though disruption had never occurred at all.